This week on the Sports Initiative podcast, I sit down with CEO at Adamas Esports Training and Performance, Caleb Cousens. He discusses the growth of esports and why it may challenge traditional sports in the future, the workload for those involved in the industry, and the current culture they perform in, as well as projections for the future and the increased professionalisation of the esports arena. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, please make sure you share it with friends and family. I hope you enjoy.
Perfect. So Caleb, as we've just said there, technology was against us today, but we got there in the end. But how are things? Are you all safe and well?
Yeah, everything is good. Technology this early in the morning can be a challenge, but we persevered and we're here. So looking forward to this chat.
Good. So I think this is a really nice opportunity to probably delve into a space that probably I'm quite unfamiliar with, and probably a lot of my listeners aren't that necessarily familiar with as well. So, do you want to kind of give an overview of who you are, and then what you do, and I guess why you do it as well?
Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, my name's Caleb Cousens. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders at Adamas Esports Training and Performance. And really what we do at Adamas is we provide a traditional sports model of athlete support to esports athletes. And so we support some of the biggest esports teams around the world. And really, our goal is that we fuel the peak performance of the world-class gaming organizations. We empower the coaches we work with to lead their teams to optimal performance. And we develop skills and habits to increase the esports athletes' performance and longevity. We came in back in 2018 when there was next to no support for these young men and women who were competing in esports, and we just saw a need to give these competitors the tools they needed to succeed both in their sport but also in life. As a longtime sports fan and a small A athlete myself, I've seen the impact that sport and good coaches and competition can have on young lives, and wanted to have an impact in gaming and esports.
Perfect. So I think the first question is esports. What are we talking about as an industry? Obviously, everyone would have heard and seen it is growing. What kind of what's the size of it? What's the magnetism of it in terms of at the top end at your 2K tournaments or that type of stuff, or your FIFA online stuff, selling out arenas? What does that actually look like from a practical perspective?
Yeah, so esports is, first of all esports is basically a catch-all category name. It's like saying sports, and so there are many sub sports under the realm of esports. You've got every major game title has its own esport by and large. So you've got Call of Duty and League of Legends and Valorant, and all of these very popular games worldwide have their own professional leagues where professionals compete on a regular basis. Esports is one of the fastest growing sports on the planet, not only from a participation standpoint, but also from an audience and a viewership standpoint. And so there's more and more attention heading in the esports direction and leaving traditional sports. So you'll, especially here in North America, you hear all the time about how the major audiences of the NFL and the NHL and the MLB are all getting older and getting smaller, whereas esports is continuing to grow and it's only getting younger because all of the kind of millennial and younger generations are spending a lot more time gaming and watching streamers and esports competitions than they're watching traditional sports at this point. And so you're seeing more and more these big tournaments in the bigger leagues, yes, fill out fill out stadiums. I know. So the League of Legends World Championships, which happens every fall, always happens in massive stadiums. And so a few years ago, it was in one of the stadiums in Japan that were used for, or no, I think it was in Korea that was used for the World Cup back in 2022. And this year it's in the Chase Center here in or down in San Francisco in the Bay Area, so where the Golden State Warriors play. And so more and more they're filling out massive stadiums. You have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people watching online, and it's a big going concern.
And in terms of if you're looking at traditional sports, if you like, I know NBA 2K, for example, have quite a strong link with almost every organization having their own esports team that's affiliated to them. So I guess, how do those relationships work? And using maybe 2K as an example, because it's quite a good one, what does that look like from your traditional model? And then what are the similarities and differences then with the esports model?
So typically, I can't speak too knowledgeably about NBA 2K specifically, but in esports as a whole, many of the massive esports organizations are owned by owners that own some of the biggest traditional sports franchises in the world as well. And so I can speak to I think what you're getting at a little bit is there's definitely a disconnect still between traditional sport and esports, where they're like, when it's the same owner, but the support being provided for the two different entities is very different. And so and part of that is because esports is still developing as a profession, as an industry. There's still a lot of professionalization needed at all levels. But part of that is because, yeah, for example, Kroenke Sports and Entertainment, and they own Arsenal FC, they own the LA Rams, they own like a ton of big sports franchises. They also own a number of esports teams, and their esports teams get some support from a health and performance training, but nothing near to as holistic, to as intense as the support that their traditional sports teams do. And so there's a lot of work to be done. That's part of why we are here doing what we're doing at Adamas, is to try to set the best practices for this industry and try to show teams the impact that a good performance coach can have on both team performance, but also team culture and long-term performance. And so, yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, no, for sure it does. I guess this may be a slightly challenging one to ask, and I know there'll be differences because there is in the Premier League or whatever sport you want to go to. But on a financial level, what type of financial rewards are there for individuals at the very top end of esports? What are they looking like, salary wise or earning wise?
Yeah, it's getting bigger and bigger every year, much like the entire industry itself. Revenues are going up. Player salaries are going up. The player support is going up slowly and slowly. At the moment, you're looking at, if you're a professional esports athlete, you're making, let's call it a minimum of $60,000-$70,000 US per year, and at the highest level, you're making kind of a couple million a year, and it spans the gamut in between. That will continue going up. Again, I'm a big believer that traditional media and traditional brands have yet to understand the attention being put on esports right now from a just eyeball and the demographic of those eyeballs. I think when that happens, you're going to see a lot more of an exodus of some of that traditional money going from traditional sports into esports, which is just going to further inflate and increase all kind of player salaries, the support for the players, the infrastructure in the entire industry.
And I guess, well, there's two questions here. The first one is, why do you think this resonates so much with a wider audience? Maybe more so than mainstream sport. Why are we seeing people move from younger age groups move across to esports rather than traditional?
I think it's a good question, and I guess before I start that, I'll say there will always be. I think there are certain traditional sports that will always likely be top of the heap. So again, football or soccer for the North Americans watching will always be number one. I think globally it's going to always be hard for any single esport, because remember, esports is a category. Each title is its own esport. And it's going to be hard for any single title to compete with the size of football. But I think using North American sports leagues as an example, I think you will start to see a number of sports leagues lose their place in the pecking order to the Call of Duty leagues, to the League of Legends, to the Overwatch leagues, as the industry continues to evolve. Remind me of your question again, just.
And why does it resonate with people so much? Or why do you think that people will lose?
I think at the end of the day, the games are just so fun to play. And so all the generations who are growing up playing video games are loving the game. And then it's just like when I was a kid, I grew up playing soccer, and then eventually I became a football fan, and I was watching the Premier League and the Champions League, and that kids are now growing up gaming more than they're necessarily playing traditional sports, and they want to watch the best at what they do on a daily basis, and so they're watching their favorite streamers on Twitch, or they're watching the biggest tournaments in the game that they play, because that's what they're interested in. So I think it's a change in behavior of kind of new generations, and even my generation. So like I play League of Legends, and League of Legends is probably the biggest esport, well, definitely the biggest esport in the world. And I will admit that there are weekends where instead of throwing on the Premier League game, I'm throwing on the live League of Legends game instead. And so it's where people are putting their time, and then people want to learn from and see how the best in the world do it, just like everyone in traditional sport always has.
And this may be completely wrong, so please correct me if it is. Do you think it's more of an attainable goal for some individuals as well? So if you imagine, if you've got someone in the middle of nowhere in Canada that plays hockey, but how's he going to ever get seen by an NHL scout? Or he might have a profile though, he's going to be 5'4", and they'll go, well, you're never going to be an NBA player because of that. Whereas being a gamer, it's kind of like, well, if it's me in my bedroom, I can hone this skill enough to potentially have a pathway that could take me down this route, and I'm not requiring luck or recruitment from someone else.
Yes, I think there's definitely an element of, there's a lot less, or there's the potential for a lot less subjectivity as it comes to like how to go pro in esports versus traditional sports. Traditional sports, it's a lot more on like network and luck and politics, and there's a lot going into it. Whereas esports, you can always climb the ranked ladder of your game, and if you get to a certain rank, you're going to get noticed by the right people in the professional scene. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll get a job at pro, but it's much easier, I would say, to get noticed if you are in that kind of 1% skill level, that versus in traditional sports, where if you're a Canadian, although this is slowly changing, but if you're Canadian looking to go into professional football, like you got to really hope that your coach here has great connections overseas, or that you get seen by the right person when you go on tour over in the UK or something. There's a lot of luck, and a lot of the stars have to align a lot more.
And then nicely onto my next question, which is, what makes a good player? What makes someone be part of that 1%, or someone who's at the top category of their game? Is there a common thread that you can think of that separates the best from the rest?
There's a number of things, and the core the core idea in the industry right now is that it's the grind culture. It's that the people who play the game the most are going to improve the most and eventually be the best. And you get that at the pro level and all the way through. And there's an element of that, because one difference between esports and traditional sports is that in esports, the rules change. The sport changes every 2 weeks or so. And so what I mean by that is, like, the game is being updated continuously. And so character stats are changing, and the map that you're playing on is changing, and different timers are changing. So it'd be like in the NBA, changing the shot clock every 2 or 3 weeks to a different time, and every team needing to relearn how to play the game in a lot of ways. And so that grind mentality is absolutely necessary in a lot of cases, because the game is constantly changing. And so these teams are having to be able to adapt to it. And so being adaptable is one of the things. For the individual players themselves, pattern recognition is a really key mental skill to have, and mental skills in general. It's a very cognitive based sport. There's lots of physical mechanics about it too, twitch speed in terms of like how, like, wrist movement and that, but it is cognitively driven. And so mental skills, focus, pattern recognition, communication skills are really important. And so most of these esports are team esports, and so you're dealing with like hundreds of actions per minute happening for a 30-minute to an hour long game, and you're having to communicate almost that fast as well, because you need to let your teammates know what's going on in your microcosm of the game itself. And so I would say, yeah, as a few examples, it would be pattern recognition, adaptability, communication skills, and then the commitment to hone your craft in game and just play the game as much as you can, and understand all of the different variables and changing aspects of it.
Yeah, I think we'll get into the skill side of it later, because it'd be interesting to see the work that individuals do to try and improve that if they can. I guess the framing of that before is, what does a professional player's week look like? So in terms of them actually sitting down physically playing the game that they're obviously a pro in or part of a team in, what does a working week for an average professional esports player look like?
Typically, a lot of these teams and athletes will wake up around 10 a.m. And then their practice will start, let's say, at 1 p.m. And so between 10 and 1, sometimes you'll have a team breakfast, you'll have different content asks that might be had. So content is a big part of this industry, like it is more and more in traditional sports as well. So they'll be doing filming and different kind of things for their content team. Then come 1 o'clock, basically you're looking at a 6 to 8 hour scrim block, and scrimmage. So it's like the practice session. And so for the next 6 to 8 hours, they are playing competitive practice matches against their competitive teams in their league. And so again, that's part of the reality and difference between esports and traditional sports right now too, is squads are bare minimum. You don't have many subs in esports, and so you don't have enough to do an inter-squad game most of the time. And so practice typically happens against the teams you play against in your actual competitive matches every week as well. So that's a little bit of a strange reality, but it is the reality right now. And so for 6 to 8 hours, they're playing matches. They're reviewing VODs after those matches to discuss what they could improve, strategy, that kind of thing. And then after the 8-hour session, so you're talking 7 or 8 p.m. at night, that's where they'll often grab a quick dinner, and then most of the players will go back to their personal setups and jump on their PC or their console and play solo queue. And solo queue is basically they jump on and play ranked competitive play by themselves to continue honing their craft, and that can happen for another 4 to 6 hours a day, and then they hit the sack, and then they wake up and do it all over again the next morning. And that happens typically 6 days a week throughout the season. And then in the off season, they're typically going and they're solo queuing for, again, 6 to 12 hours a day to make sure that they're staying on top and to prepare for the next season. So it is very much a grind, and much more a grind, I would say, than any traditional sport in a lot of ways, because traditional sport, you're playing your sport maybe for an hour or two, maybe 3 a day. You're on field, then maybe you're doing a bit of gym and mental work, but like your work day is, the work day in traditional sport is, I would argue, a lot shorter and probably easier in a lot of ways, especially from a cognitive perspective, than what esports athletes go through.
And in terms of a team setup, obviously you'll have a team manager, I'd imagine, or a coach that kind of, I guess, picks the players. But how does that work in terms of creating a team? And do people kind of have defined roles within the team of what they got to do depending on the game you're playing? So if you had Call of Duty, for example, would you create a team of someone or a couple of people maybe are very good snipers on a particular map, and people that are good at flanking, someone who's maybe particularly good at going down the middle with particular types of weapon? Is there strategy within that, and how does a team manager create those type of teams to then maybe have strategy towards success?
Yeah, so in every game there are specific roles or positions that are being played, and so teams are built on the back of the needs that exist, and so filling a specific role and finding that skill set. Oftentimes in esports, rosters are built based on existing player relationships more than anything else. Talent ID and scouting is still very much in early stages in esports in terms of what teams know to look for in kind of their next talent for their team. And so it's often just based on what some of their existing players, what relationships they have, who they can kind of attract to their team, and then making that happen contractually. Yeah.
And in terms of from a strategy point of view, how do they then come around strategizing the game for a particular map or a particular scenario or a particular opponent, dependent on their strengths or weaknesses, etc.?
Yeah, and so that's the role of the whole team. Typically, that happens in the VOD reviews. It's obviously led by the coaches and the analysts of every team. But they will prepare for the next team they're playing. They'll review VOD of what they do, their opponent's particular strategies, and then they will, in their scrimmages and in their strategy sessions, then discuss kind of each individual's role in order to then beat their opponents. And so it's very much it's led by the coach and the analyst, but it's very much a team driven process, I would say.
And sorry, just think VOD, I'm assuming, is the video footage of the
video on demand. Yeah, so it's the video footage of previous games that they can review. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then within the teams, is there kind of a hierarchy of players? So have you got kind of your NFL drafts on my mind at the minute, so I'm going to go down that route. But do you have kind of your high draft pick for the ones that there's expectations on to perform high profile roles, and then maybe some tertiary players in and around that, or is it very equitable in terms of how people play?
No, it's a lot like traditional sports in that way. Most teams have like their star player or one or two star players. Oftentimes they'll have a young prodigy who's like the next big star, and it varies from esport to esport, and from title to title, but it's very personality driven, and because content plays such a big role in a lot of these teams' revenue and business, the bigger the personality, the the more importance they have in the overall structure of the business as well. And so it creates interesting dynamics from team to team. But yeah, it's definitely part of the mix.
Sounds like I might need to come into the talent ID for esports. That might be an interesting transition for me to make rather than traditional football.
It's honestly, it's in, I mean, the entire industry, the more great minds from other industries that come in, the stronger we will be. I mean, we've seen such a brain drain from technology, from traditional sport, from business to come into esports as kind of the one of the big trending industries of the last 5 or so years, and I think the industry has made leaps and bounds and progressed by like light years ahead of where we would have been because of that. But always looking for more talent to just again build the right foundation, and that's part of why the team I've built and like some really great people from traditional sports have come over to Adamas, because we've got the chance to impact and to build a foundation and learn from traditional sports, and hopefully not make a lot of the same mistakes that traditional sports have made, and build a new sport and build it in a way that we think will be sustainable and healthy for the young athletes going through it, and will last, so that our kids and their kids, when they're maybe looking at esports as a potential career rather than football or hockey or what have you, it's an industry that we can very happily allow them to pursue as
Yeah,
parents.
that makes complete sense. I think that leads us nicely on to what is the role of your company. So obviously we've mentioned a lot there around the teams and the teams that play specific titles or specific games. Obviously you mentioned that you kind of partner with a lot of these teams or support a lot of these teams. So what for you as a company do you actually do, and what can you provide, and what support do these individuals actually need?
Yeah, so we provide performance coaching to professional esports teams around the world, and really we support the partner teams we work with at three levels. So we work with them at the highest level, the organizational level. We work with organizational leadership to put the right culture and team values and like performance excellence behaviors in place to build the foundation for performance both now but into the future. Then we work with coaches. Coaching in esports is an interesting state right now, where coaches are hired on the back of their in-game sport knowledge, but not necessarily on the back of their leadership skills or communication skills. And so they are great. They understand the technical, tactical aspect of what they do, like often better than anyone, but they really need to be leveled up on the coaching side of things and on the leadership side of things. And so we are working with 30 or 40 coaches over the last year or so in professional esports to just mentor them and give them the skills and the support to be able to do their jobs more effectively, and to hopefully have their job for as long a time as possible. And so supporting coaches is a big part of what we do. And then kind of the third layer of it is working with the athletes. And so really we meet coaches on my team are some of the best coaches that I've ever worked with in traditional sports or otherwise, and they meet these men and women where they're at in their career, in the game itself, and help them overcome challenges, whether that be physical challenges, mental challenges, whether it's more just they need someone to talk to and vent to and like figure out, like we've had situations where young players will move across the world for a job, and we will be there to support that young person to acclimatize to a new culture and to like find the right community to put themselves in. And so it's really just supporting these athletes to help them be able to perform when it matters in their competition, and not let kind of the outside competition stuff affect their in-game performance.
So this question is going to be two-pronged, I guess. From watching that documentary and I guess from my own perception, I'd imagine that there's quite a physical toll that this is going to take in terms of people sitting at screens or computer screens or whatever for prolonged periods. But also, you mentioned cognitively that it's quite tiring. You're having to process a lot of information very quickly and act upon it. What type of demands is being put on individuals, I guess, in a physical perspective and then a cognitive perspective, and how do you support them in both of those areas in particular?
Yeah. So on the physical side, they are sitting in front of their computer screens for 12 to 16 hours a day. And so with that comes a ton of overuse injuries, a ton of just discomfort and pain that these athletes are experiencing. And so physical therapy is a key aspect to just like treat, but also hopefully prevent injury, keeping these players mobile. And so mobility work, yoga, that kind of thing is super important.
Is there any particular common injuries that people pick up that you go, yeah?
I mean, it's typically upper extremity. It's wrist, elbow, back, both upper and lower, neck. Those would be the easy ones, the obvious ones. And so on the physical side, that I would say would be, I mean, eye health is another one, because they're staring at a screen for so long, like sports optometry, and like making sure that their eyes have enough rest on a regular basis, and blue light, and making sure that that's optimized for them. Like there's a lot on the optometry side of things as well. But on to your point, on the mental side, this being a cognitively driven sport, burnout is a huge problem in this industry, because you're playing 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Well, honestly, 7 days a week, because on their days off, that's all they're doing as well. They're jumping on the game and playing. Burnout, both physically and mentally, is a big one. And so part of where I think the industry will be going, and it's still going to take a while, but the concept of periodization in esports isn't really a thing yet. And so just training smarter and not harder, and figuring out what that means for esports, because again, esports has different needs than traditional sports, because the rules and the game changes so often. And so you have to play way more than you would a traditional sport. But I do think that there's a better balance to be struck. And if they're, and more teams are doing this, but if they're getting proper physical exercise, if they're getting enough sleep, if they're eating the proper things, that's all going to have an impact on reducing burnout, and also just optimizing the training environment and the training schedules of these athletes. I think will be the next step after the lifestyle piece gets sorted. On the mental side, yeah, I mean, a lot of times it's these players just need someone to talk to. They again, they will be brought in from across the country, across the world. They're coming into a new environment. They are professionals, having never been professional in anything before, and coming from a sport that doesn't have a structured amateur scene. And so there isn't a youth system to come up in esports really at the moment. There isn't a path to pro, a clear path to pro that exists. And so these kids at the end of the day just need a coach to help guide them through their life a little bit at the stage that they're at. And that's part of what we do. And then we also train a lot of the core mental skills. And so like I mentioned before, like whether that be focus or self-talk, or like teaching them about goal setting, and like there's so much low-hanging fruit there, and mental skills, sports psychology is definitely a space where we focus, because that's where these athletes, I think, need the most help in order to perform at their best throughout a long season. But it's really listening to the players, hearing where they're at and what their challenges are, and then helping them address those challenges. And so being good listeners, and then giving them the tools to get better, whether that's physical ailments, mental, or if it's just performance based or life based. We're here to have an impact on every individual's life that we work with, as well as the broader industry as a whole.
And in terms of, you mentioned kind of the focus perspective, so you can use that as an example. I think that'd be quite a nice one. So obviously for someone to try and focus for 8 hours is not impossible. It's not going to happen. So if you're looking at, I'd imagine, I could be wrong, that you're trying to get them to learn when to switch on and switch off. So between rounds, maybe taking a break, or
Yes.
how to disengage, and then the ability to switch back on again when you're playing for periods, and understanding maybe moments of lull in the game where you can ease off, and maybe high stress moments when you need to step forward, etc. How do you go around, one, helping players identify that in the game, and then two, how do you help them train that as well?
Yeah, and so part of it is we don't touch any kind of the tech. We don't touch the technical tactical aspects of the game, and so we leave that to their in-game coaches. But we give them the tools, mental skills, and otherwise that they can then implement within the settings that they have. And again, because so little has been done in the industry to date, like the lowest hanging fruit is, okay, like getting the right warm up in before you sit down to game is going to kind of get your mind warmed up and your brain going, and get you into a flow state faster. In between games, to your point, is like, what are we doing? Are we just sitting there like randomly, like keeping your wrist warm by doing different kind of games in between the game that you're playing? Or are you getting up and moving around, or like just getting away from the screen for 2 minutes when you're waiting? And so it's starting at that very, very basic level, and giving them the low hanging fruit tools and suggestions that they can add into their life without actually impacting how much they're playing their game and whatnot. And then after they've mastered that core kind of first level, it will be layering on the next level of complexity and layering it on. But we are, at least at Adamas, we are not interested in trying to foster massive behavior change in a short amount of time, because that's not going to work. These kids have their entire lives been told that, hey, whether it's by traditional media or by their parents, that, hey, like, get outside, like go be kids, go play sports, and they don't need us telling them that. They've already kind of heard that their entire lives, and what they need is they need to know that there are certain things they can do that are pretty easy to do, that will have performance implications to their game, because that's what they care about. They care about getting better at their game. And as long as you can tie back some of these kind of small behavior changes back to performance, we typically see a lot more interest in them than if you're just saying, hey, like, get out of your mom's basement, stop drinking Red Bull, eating Cheetos, like just all the gamer stereotypes you hear of all the time. It's like, no, you are athletes, and we will step by step help you look more and more like athletes in what you do on a daily basis.
And so, in terms of maybe trying to develop skills or develop capacity, is there any particular training programs you guys use around this? So, like, if we look at the eyesight one, for example, um, is there a particular vision center which allows you to be able to access more of a screen or react quicker to screens, which then obviously provide you with feedback? Um, or from a physical perspective, you mentioned in terms of fast twitch being around hands and wrists and elbows, etc. So, is there any particular strategies or methodologies that you encourage them to train in order to try and be quicker on the buttons, etc.? Are those two things that you actually work on in a practical setting?
Honestly, yes and no. And so again, because of where the industry's at, like, that I feel like is a couple layers deeper than than what the industry is ready for. Like, the fact that these teams aren't just doing a decent, or a lot of these teams aren't doing a physical warm up like before they sit down, or like they're just not doing any physical exercise on a daily basis. Period. Like, there's so much education and tools needed to be given to these athletes before you get to that more specific skill training side of things. And also, it, like, a lot of a lot of research still needs to be done in gaming and esports and cognitive performance, I would say, so that we can show these teams and these athletes that yes, this training protocol does increase in-game performance. Because at the moment, we can make assumptions and make claims based on what we know from traditional sport, and I would venture to guess that a lot of them are actually true claims, but if extrapolated over to esports. But without the research, um, esports competitors just are not really interested in even having the conversation, because it's like, I'm not a traditional sport athlete. They very much know that, and they don't want to be necessarily even treated like a traditional sport athlete. And so until there's more research out there in terms of, okay, what moves the dial in terms of performance training, it's going to be hard to convince anyone of doing some sort of funny plyometric or whatever, because this is going to help your wrist strength, which is going to give you more longevity in your career. And so there's a lot of things happening at the same time. And in parallel, you've got research happening. You've got groups like ours doing the actual performance training, and we're involved in a lot of the research as well. And it's all going to eventually hit a critical point where we can start using one to feed off the other. Whereas at the moment, they're both kind of trying to get to a bare minimum baseline, and then proceed from there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely, it absolutely does. And I guess the next question is, where do you see this going? So obviously, you're kind of at the infancy of this type of support being in place and trying to, I guess, culturally affect some of the teams you're working with to say, well, have you thought about this or have you
Yeah.
thought about that? In the medium to long term, with the current trajectory that this supports on, where do you see this ending up with athletes in this area?
I mean, I think the traditional sport model is closer to where I think this is headed. I think there is, um, I think in the next 10 years, you're going to have all of the biggest teams will have a performance staff. Whereas at the moment, every team pretty much has one performance person, a performance coach who's kind of supposed to be a jack of all trades, which is completely unfair to the performance coach, and just not super effective in the team environment either. And so I think you'll have teams who have their physio, who have their mental skills trainer, who has their personal trainer, strength and conditioning coach, whatever you want to call it. And that integrated approach to health and performance, I think, will just be the gold standard. And as the economics of the industry continue to grow and revenues continue to grow, teams will have the budgets to be able to actually do that. Because at the moment, they just don't necessarily have, or they're not willing to allocate the budgets that they have to performance coaching.
No, that makes complete sense. I guess the last question for me on this, which is, who is the most impressive individual you've worked with in this space and why? So that could be either a gamer in terms of someone that you think is just outstanding in the application of the game, or someone who is in around it as a coach or a mentor for these individuals who's just phenomenal at their job, and why?
That's a tough question to answer, just because I'm not the one coaching these athletes, and so it's hard for me to pick one. But what I would say is that there are very forward thinking organizations who are already trying to provide their athletes with more support than is the standard in the industry right now, and we're working with a number of them. And it's funny, back to the link between traditional sport and esports. And so one of our partners is the Golden Guardians of the League of Legends, LCS. So it's the North American League of Legends League, and the Golden Guardians are owned by the Golden State Warriors of the NBA, and so there's a level of understanding within the organization as a whole of the support needed to provide their esports athletes, and even the staff that they've hired, from their GM Danon to their coaching staff, Sam and Nick and others. They get this stuff already, and so we're working with them to provide even more capacity and more support for their coaches and for their athletes. But there are teams who are providing the roadmap and the template, and kind of pioneering, blazing a trail, I guess, for, I think, what all esports teams will be doing in the future. And they still have a ways to go as well, but it's I'll shout out the Golden Guardians.
Perfect. No, listen, Caleb, I think a really fascinating discussion in terms of where obviously esports is at, and some of the comparisons and parallels between traditional sports and the esports world, and also maybe some considerations in terms of things that we could be doing better, or equally that you guys could be doing better. So really appreciate your time, and hopefully catch up with you again soon.
Yeah, looking forward to having an update chat here in a year or so, and seeing where esports has come and what else we've learned.
Perfect. Catch you soon.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Sports Initiative podcast with me, Michael Wright. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram at the Sports Initiative Podcast, and share this podcast with friends and family. I'll see you next week.